Um, but coming back to the AI thing, right? Like how AI intersects with Web3, I think it's just not agents and like the user experience, but there's like a whole bunch of stuff, right? There's stuff in decentralized machine learning training. Like right now, cloud cloud providers are the only places where you can really train models, or like you have to have your on-prem, data center, or like, you're a hacker or whatever, and you're using your machine's GPU, or your student and you're using your university cluster's GPU.
Hmm.
You've got that system, right? Um, there's that. There's running machine learning models for inference. So like when you're running these models in production, right, you can imagine Netflix as an example of Netflix is recommending you what to watch, right? That, I mean, at the end of the day, that's a machine learning model somewhere running a prediction on what you like based on, a whole bunch of inputs into the model. How do you run that on a decentralized network? What are the implications of privacy, of security, of, performance? That's super important, right?
Yep.
If you train your model on a decentralized network and uh, then deploy it on a centralized computing platform, does the way it work change? Um, I think there's a whole bunch of
Yeah.
interesting stuff that we can go into here. And then finally, um, what happens, like the centralized cloud providers have like X amount of GPUs that you can train on at Y price, right? What if you don't want to train on those GPUs? What do you do, right? I think there are a lot of interesting questions in this, like decentralized machine learning space, decentralized compute network space, also that are going to be super interesting, and I'm interested to see how it's going to play out over the next like 5 years, right? Will people start training models on decentralized compute networks, or will the big cloud providers, uh, continue to like grow their market share, and will on-prem or local machines for computation take off, or is that something that's going to also spiral downward as it has over the last 2 decades? So I think
Um,
some of these things are interesting topics. What are your thoughts on these, Wes?
So many things. I mean, it's funny about like the whole decentralization movement. A lot of it has to do with giving ownership back to the user of both their data and also like the benefits of their data. And so, to your point, your data in this case and for ML training needs to be shared among other people externally in order to be trained. So that is, I think, a fascinating core issue with it. I see some folks. There's a couple different solutions. There's like the zero knowledge approach, which is like they don't necessarily have to have access to proving to running your data in a shared system. It could be they could have access to data privately, and then they could show you a proof that they ran the data set right. There's also this thing where they would encrypt the data and then send the encryption key to you so that you could perform the compute over it without actually unencrypting the data. You couldn't see the raw data. And then there's like fully homomorphic encryption. Um, all of these solutions are making a lot of progress. Like technically, there's a lot of engineering and VC money going into the space, but it really hasn't been solved yet. So then you're almost left with, can I make interesting insights from ML on open data sets or data sets that I'm
Mhm.
okay with sharing portions of? Um, and so that problem space gets a little bit more nuanced. I've seen some companies that are talking about like federated data sets where they'll share versions of the data amongst like groups of organizations in sort of a semi-trusted way, which makes more sense, and you don't have to worry about like the encryption of it and all that. But I still think there's some big technical issues to be solved there.
Yeah, I agree. I mean, I'm a big believer that decentralized compute networks to train anything. I mean, decentralized compute networks in general are going to come, and they provide a lot of value. There's definitely there are definitely some advantages. Like you have more options on how to use your compute, right? Like you have more CPU options, you have more GPU options. Um, you're not locked. You don't have vendor lock-in, right? Like it's anti-censorship. Right now, it's like, I mean, one thing that I'm not a big fan of is all these big tech companies are going to Congress and being like, please regulate us. And I don't believe
Yes.
that it's because they care about like AI safety and all of these things. I think it's because like they're like, oh, like with every regulation that's ever existed, it helps the big companies, right? Like, I think I saw somewhere that someone trained a LLM on, um, was it Mosaic ML or something like that? I think they have a open source LLM that's almost as good as GPT-4 or better than GPT-4 in some cases. I think I saw something on Twitter this morning where like somebody has built an open source LLM from the UAE that's better than GPT-4. Now, again, all these are, unverified, so I need to look into them. But I think this is going to happen where like people are going to build open source models that are better than, what OpenAI and Google and can offer. And like it makes sense for the big companies to be like, hey, let's regulate us
Yes.
before startups disrupt us, right? One of
Yes.
one of the
Yes. Yes.
reasons
Yes.
why one of the reasons why I'm super excited about the decentralized machine learning network is, you could imagine Google being like, well, you can't use these many compute resources to train LLMs because it affects our business, or Microsoft or whatever,
Yes.
right? Um,
Yes. No, it's funny you
so
mentioned that. Yeah, like when I formerly worked at a hyperscaler, and without saying anything specific that happened at the hyperscaler, I know that public, let's say, reference a different hyperscaler that I didn't work for, Amazon. I know they went through a lot of extent to crack down on Bitcoin mining back in 2016, 2017, because people were using the cloud for that purpose because it was another way to make money. But it was, the whole practice of it was in that case sort of frowned upon by the cloud providers. But to your point, if you have black market AI and black market machine learning training that's not fully approved and it's happening on the side, does that mean that a hyperscaler has to push back and they have to run, algorithms to detect if it's happening on their
mhm.
network and try to shut people down for doing it?
Yeah, absolutely. So I think all these things are really interesting. I do think that for, I think in general, this is true for Web3 and decentralized compute as well, specifically. But like for decentralized compute, it really, there has to be some good use cases, but really it has to be um, more flexible in the approach. So let's just talk about like
Yeah,
AI training, right? It has to be more flexible in terms of like how you can train models, when you can train models, where you can train models, um, but it has to be cheaper, and the privacy has to be there, right? Like if I'm a company, uh, I for let's just talk about like the enterprise business use case, right, for a sec. Like if
hmm
I'm a company, I don't want to. I know mostly that Google is not in the business of like stealing my model weights or my pre-trained model or whatever, right? Like so you don't. But and if something happens, you can sue them in like the U.S. court of. And that's like a really big, people don't under maybe people don't realize this, but that's like a really big thing that people really like about centralized cloud providers. Like every tech person I talk to outside of Web3, they're like, can you imagine what kind of world we have to be in for like Google and AWS and Amazon to lose like market share and you not trust them, right? So many Fortune 500
yeah,
companies trust them. Everyone trusts them
yeah,
generally, right? For you not to trust them. And we've like moved to the world where it's like, because of, let's say, laws and the legal system and the court system, if something goes wrong, you can sue them, and it might not work in your favor. They've got big lawyers, etc. But at the end of the day, if they've done something horribly wrong, they will be punished for it, right?
yes.
So how do you deal with these kinds of things in decentralized networks, right? How do you make sure your data is safe? How do you make sure your model weights don't get exposed and are not being able to read by someone who's running a data center or offering their compute services? How do you make sure that there is some trust that like the model that you're running on some cluster with some GPU on in GCP or AWS is running that model, is running that GPU. If you paid for that entire machine, you're using the entire machine, right? How do you make sure that exists in Web3? I think all of these things need to be addressed for, enterprise and small business use case to move to decentralized web. Um,
I think you're totally right, and it's interesting thinking about like to your point about the premium that the Googles and the Amazons have in terms of trust, and then if you look at a network like Ethereum or Bitcoin, you have this trust in a decentralized network that because the math and the protocol is going to ensure that my transaction is going to go through, I can trust the math. But if you could take all the benefits or any of the benefits of those hyperscalers and their functionality, and you could provide those same similar functionalities in a decentralized network, and you could say I'm going to run a website or I'm going to train an ML model. and you could verify that trust mathematically in some sense, that seems like a massive
Hmm.
opportunity. I think that that really gets at the heart of like what this whole thing is about.
Yeah, 100% agree. Like cryptographically verifying that, the output of the computation is right, the model ran correctly, the GPU that I paid for was used, right? If someone can figure out answers to all these problems, I think decentralized compute will maybe not overtake, will be a big chunk of the entire compute market size. So I think that there's something really interesting there. Um, and yeah, I think, you know, just like I think this whole like privacy security thing is like a big thing, right? Like in the open source space, in the academia space, you can get away with running, or like say you're a Web3 builder, you can get away with running, your data on uh, open compute platforms. But until these problems are solved, it'll always be like a niche use case.